Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardari is in Moscow on a two-day official visit on the invitation of his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov. And they held a meeting and discussed a wide range of issues and the areas of bilateral interest. And after the meeting, both addressed a joint presser. Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardari said that strengthening relations with Russia remains an important priority for Pakistan. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said both the sides would continue to make efforts for peace in the region. And he also said that both the countries have convergence of views on key international and regional issues. Earlier, we saw a Russian delegation headed by Energy Minister Nikolai Shilginov visited Pakistan and discussed trade, economic and energy cooperation between Pakistan and Russia in particular. At that moment, he conveyed a message from President Vladimir Putin, who had said that Russia views Pakistan as its key partner in South Asia and the Islamic world. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif at that time noted the keen desire on both sides to enhance the relationship in economy, energy and investment and trade. In today's show, we'll be trying to understand the trajectory of the bilateral relationship between Pakistan and Russia. And let me bring in our panelists. We are honored to have been joined in the studio by Professor Dr. Aqab Malik. He is associated with Center for International Peace and Stability at NUST. Dr. Malik, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News tonight. Really appreciate that. We are also honored to have been joined in the studio by Mr. Nasir Khan, his former ambassador. Mr. Nasir Khan, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. And on Skype, we are being joined by Mr. Harley Schlanger. He's political analyst. Mr. Schlanger, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. Now, let me begin the discussion with you, Mr. Khan. And now, how significant do you think we've seen high-level engagements between Russia and Pakistan most recently? How significant an impetus this particular visit by Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardari to Moscow would add to that already existing bilateral relationship?
I believe this visit has come about because of an invitation that Mr. Sergei Lavrov extended to our foreign minister in one of the recent bilateral meetings. And so, you know, to be able to take up the invitation and go and visit and try to create better relations at a time like this is important, in my opinion. Now, the question is, will something substantial come out of this? I think as far as Russia being a regional player for Pakistan, it's extremely important, and our interests also converge vis-a-vis Afghanistan. Both of us are concerned about the government there, about why is it that they don't have a more inclusive government, why is it that they've gone back on certain, you know, promises to be a little bit more tolerant this time. And also, the most important thing, that their territory ought not to be used for any acts of terror across the border. So we are both concerned about this, and this, I think, will be one of the major areas of discussion. Apart from that, Russia can also help in terms of investments in the future. I think our foreign policy ought to think in the long term. And in the long term, we should gear ourselves, we should position ourselves to invite certain foreign investment from Russia. For example, in steel, they are strong. In mining, they are strong. They've been involved in a pipeline over here. So, you know, these are things that we need to start at this stage and then slowly build upon. Then you commonly hear the discussion about being able to get cheap oil from Russia, cheap energy from Russia. Well, as far as I can see, unless we have pipelines, more connectivity, it's not going to be very practical, not to mention the sanctions. You see, India, for example, is able to avoid some of these sanctions because of their importance, you know, their clout with Western nations, and also because they have had some purchase of oil from Russia in the past. So they can say, you know, we have this ongoing thing, we can't simply cut it off. Whereas Pakistan has not had that.
Right, Mr. Khan, we'll be discussing a number of points you've highlighted, and we'll be discussing one by one regarding the Afghanistan issues, the convergence of views of Pakistan and Russia regarding that, the security and stability in the region as well when it comes to enhancing the trade and investment ties also, as well as when we talk about the energy demand here in Pakistan and kind of new market avenues Russia is going to have when it's going to cooperate with countries like Pakistan. Dr. Malik, how significant do you think this visit, a particular visit by a foreign minister is? We have seen high-level engagements in the recent past. A high-level delegation was here headed by the energy minister. Now, energy cooperation between Pakistan and Russia was discussed. So how do you see this particular visit?
As far as I know, the energy cooperation, as you talk about, is more an agreement for Russia to provide petroleum products, liquefied natural gas later on in the year, and before that, maybe by the end of March. Agreement is more or less in process, more or less concluded. This is not related to this particular visit. This visit is more about shoring up a higher level interaction between the two countries. Given the situation in the world as well, Russia needs an outplay to other countries because it's been off balance, primarily because of what's happened in Ukraine, with the Europeans and the Americans and the Western world basically pushing against Russia for the past nearly a year now. So I think Russia is doing an outplay. It wants to look at its tentacles everywhere else in the world and establish linkages. But this is also something significant, I think. Earlier, I think in the month, Shehbaz Sharif indicated the possibility of engagement with India. Now, Russia has been an all-weather ally, or you could say partner or strategic to some extent in the past with India. And that could be a facilitator in this. I think that's a very important factor that we have to take into account. We need somebody that would be able to be more neutral as opposed to the United States, which has its own interests vis-a-vis India and in opposition to China and its necessity to support India in every aspect. So I think it's important that Pakistan sees another avenue down here and maybe encourage diplomatic relations to be enhanced and increased with a third party. And I think Russia is a key player in this. And that's, as you were explaining, long-term impact is very important, I think. Not just this current period that Pakistan is in, which we will ride over eventually. It's a matter of getting our heads together and making sure that we tighten our budgets, tighten our hold on the economy, not make these bad mistakes that we've made in the past because of ego and personality, but more focus on the necessity of the country and what it needs and engagement in the international environment. That's what we need to do.
Right. Yeah. Let me bring in Mr. Schlanger also into the discussion. Mr. Schlanger, we have seen the statement by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov that both the countries, Pakistan and Russia, would continue to make efforts for peace in the region. And this particular peace in the region is directly linked with Afghanistan. So vis-a-vis Afghanistan, how do you think both the countries can cooperate in order to ensure that the interim government over there in Afghanistan, which is led by the Taliban, keep and fulfill all those commitments that they had made to the international community?
Well, I think the Afghanistan issue is a key one where there is a convergence of interest, that you don't want Afghanistan to become a center of terrorism, but you also want to provide emergency aid, which Pakistan has been doing. Emergency aid and not just food aid, but longer-term development. But this fits in with what the previous speaker just said, that we're actually looking at something long-term, a fundamental shift in relations between nations. And it's in Pakistan's interest to be very much involved in this because we're seeing a move beyond the unipolar world of the American order with the policies of the United States and Europe, not just in Ukraine, but also enforcing through international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and others, unfair policies against developing sector nations in the global south. In contrast to that, you have the Russia-China relationship, as was mentioned, Russia-India, Pakistan and China. There's an enormous potential for increasing trade in regional and national currencies to get outside of the control of this unipolar order. And this is very necessary for peace, not just in terms of the Afghan situation, but also, as the previous speaker also mentioned, between Pakistan and India. So I think in the long range, this represents a very serious effort on behalf of both countries, Russia and Pakistan, to achieve a solid relationship as part of a new emerging multilateral order.
Right. Mr. Schlanger, when it comes to Afghanistan, the Afghan Taliban had made certain commitments with the international community, and the first and the foremost was to not allow the Afghan soil to be used against any other country, especially the neighbors. So when it comes to the regional countries collaborating, of course, we know that there is a dire humanitarian crisis over there as well in Afghanistan. So there are two different fronts. The regional countries need to engage with the Afghan Taliban. Pakistan has a very clear position that in order to avert the humanitarian crisis, the international community should keep on engaging with the Taliban. But now on the other side, we see the Taliban so desperate for the recognition, the international recognition, which of course the international community has conditioned with fulfillment of all those promises made to the international community. So what's the way forward for the regional countries, especially Pakistan and Russia, first of all, in order to help avert that humanitarian crisis, and also impress upon the Taliban that they need to fulfill their promises if they look forward for that very international recognition?
Well, I think that the Taliban has to make moves in that direction, not just for the purpose of getting support from other countries, but for their own people. To deny women an education is a very dangerous and foolish idea. And I think the Russians, the Chinese, and others can talk to them about it. But I think the other part of this is that for example, on security, the ability to control borders, to wipe out terrorist networks in Afghanistan or eliminate them is somewhat difficult when the nation is so strapped for money. There's food problems, energy problems. And so the attempt to have economic relations, which could include Russia and China and also Pakistan, is absolutely crucial. But at the same time, as you mentioned, the Taliban has to move on these things, and they have to realize that unless they're willing to make some concessions, they're not going to have the capability in terms of the cooperation that's necessary to fully stabilize the situation.
Right. Mr. Khan, what's the way forward when it comes to Russia and Pakistan joining hands vis-a-vis Afghanistan, dealing with them on two fronts? First of all, Pakistan has been very clear to help avert that humanitarian crisis in the war-ravaged Afghanistan, and at the same time to make the Afghan Taliban to fulfill those promises. Now, it is very important for the regional countries, for the regional stability and peace also. So how Russia and Pakistan collectively can engage with the Taliban vis-a-vis both of these fronts?
Well, first of all, I must point out that there is no country on earth which has greater linkages and more influence in Afghanistan than Pakistan, because we have a common religion, we share common language, we share tribes and a culture from our KP region. So we will continue to have a greater influence, no matter what kind of relationships we have with the government. Within Afghanistan, we will continue to have a certain influence, and we need to leverage that. At times, we need to be more considerate, or tone down the rhetoric, and at times we need to be a little bit more strict and aggressive if they are not working to the sort of benefit of both our nations. As far as Russia is concerned, Russia is a major player in the region. It has tremendous influence over all the neighbors, the immediate neighbors, the Istans of Afghanistan. So they will always take this into consideration. Now, how should we try to improve things, and how should we try to convince the Taliban? The main thing, of course, is that they are strapped for cash. And if the humanitarian crisis were to escalate or to enlarge, then you would have a lot of problems for the Afghan Taliban within Afghanistan. So we need to convince them that by engaging with the international community, and especially with their regional neighbors, to promote trade and to have a peaceful Afghanistan, which has tremendous opportunities, whether it is in natural resources or in connectivity, from say Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, pipelines and
but
stuff.
for that trade to be enhanced, of course, there needs to be peace and stability within Afghanistan also.
True,
So,
but you know that trade itself brings a dividend of peace when there are financial stakes involved. You see, despite traditionally the government in Afghanistan has mostly had its writ in the center, in and around Kabul and Jalalabad and a few places. The rest of it is a group of different ethnicities and warlords. And they actually have a certain tacit understanding with the center. And if you create, for example, if we were to have this pipeline, the sort of revenue that they could get in transit fee is something like about $300 million a year. Imagine this being shared by the warlords along the route of this pipeline. It will be in their interest to continue to have peace over there. So what I'm trying to say is sometimes financial incentives could come first and bring peace as a dividend.
Right. Dr. Malik, what's your take regarding this particular thing? When it comes to looking for a way forward for Russia and Pakistan collectively to engage with the Afghan Taliban, it's kind of a suggestion which has been made by Dr. Khan. Do you agree with that?
I think it's important to understand that recently, in recent years, that Taliban have been reaching out to Russia and vice versa. I think more the Russians to outplay the Americans when they were in Afghanistan at the time, but they built that relationship up. Now, you mentioned the idea of warlords. I think that was prior to the Taliban. Yes, Taliban is composed of many different power centers within the whole ethos or the umbrella under Taliban. But they're generally guided by one leadership and one shura, and generally are more or less uniform compared to what they were before. Yes, they have to appreciate the different ethnicities and the different interests of the different people around the country, and that's important. However, pipelines are in the distant future. I don't think they'll happen anytime soon, primarily because of the inability of Taliban to consolidate real control over the country, because it's actually in a reactionary phase right now. By instituting harsh control, and then slowly it may, but we don't know, it may liberalize slowly, but liberalize not in the American terms or European sense. Liberalize compared to their own interpretation.
Do you think there should be a realization among the Taliban ranks if their approach is reactionary to what the world is actually doing towards them? So why shouldn't they consider fulfilling all those commitments first and let the world give them something in return?
You've got to appreciate that for 20 years we're fighting. And the mindset is going to take time to change and transform into being a government in charge of a country, rather than a group of separatists or a group of people that were fighting as guerrilla fighters. There are, like I was saying, different power centers. There are the more hawkish people, the more very hard-lined, and the more liberal, but that's not liberal in the Western sense, who are more willing to negotiate and understand. There is a big struggle and tug of war within Taliban right now, and it's a matter of how that plays out. Right now, the banning of schools for females, for example, and universities, and working in NGOs, etc., is where the harsh hardliners are winning out. But maybe that's also
that could be
a
the
bit of a
possibility
carrot.
of a tactic or
Yes,
to goad the international
that's
community.
what I was trying to say. Within the Taliban, you've got to understand they're not looking outside in the world right now. I don't think they have the capability. They're very myopic here because they fought for something so defined and black and white for 20 years, sacrificed, died for it, that they want to implement this. So they're not going to be willing to appreciate what happens outside. And they fought against the outside, fought against the Western world, and they don't want that imposition. Whether that's right or wrong is not the point. The point is that's their mentality at this moment in time. And my whole research for many years has been about this. So right now it's a tug of war in Afghanistan as well between the harsh hardliners and the more conciliatory Taliban who are willing to compromise certain things. But the fact of the matter is the harsh hardliners have the support of the troops. And unfortunately, large numbers of them are not very educated. So they look at black and white issues, and because you have support of the troops and the military, the Taliban military as you can call it, they've got structure with them, and they've got power with them, and that's how they're going to rule, unfortunately, for the time being.
Mr. Schlanger, now as you would have definitely heard Mr. Khan suggesting that economic dividend is of utmost and crucial importance to bring peace and stability in the war-ravaged Afghanistan. Do you agree with that? And if so, what the international community in particular needs to do in this regard? We see right after the Kabul takeover by the Taliban, their funds in America were frozen also at that time. So do you think it is crucial on that front to unfreeze those funds also and to give more economic opportunities to that would ensure peace and stability in Afghanistan in the longer run?
Oh, I agree with that absolutely. The question of the seizure of funds by the United States, that, in my opinion, was an illegal action. The kinds of sanctions that the United States is using against countries like Afghanistan, like Iraq, like Russia, these are not in the interests of peace. But it's especially clear in Afghanistan, where you have somewhere more than 12 to 15 million people who are facing malnutrition and starvation. To withhold funds like this is criminal. Now, this goes to the broader issue of security for Afghanistan, which, as the other speaker was saying, that they've been in a war for many years. This war is continuing, and Afghanistan is, in a sense, a pawn of the Cold War that's being run by the United States and NATO, which is trying to divide the world into two camps. Instead, as I was pointing out earlier, Russia, China, and many nations in the global south are looking at multilateral institutions that can not just provide aid, but actually pathways toward peace through mutual benefit for cooperating sovereign nations. The U.S. is trying to use, for example, India in the Quad as a force against China. So you have all these tendencies toward war at a point in which what's needed is concentration on economic cooperation, building corridors of development, and it's through that that you create the basis for an understanding.
Right, Mr. Schlanger, when we talk about, as you already have criticized very categorically, the kind of act the US administration at that time did, and if these funds continue to be frozen over there, now Pakistan has been very clear after the Kabul takeover, it provided the air bridge also for the evacuation of the international people from there, from Afghanistan. Now, continuously, it had been urging the international community to practically engage with the Afghan Taliban. So if the regional countries are successful enough to give that cushion or respite to the Afghan Taliban, and if they get a good inflow of the economic assistance towards them, so keeping the pattern of what they've done in the past, they struck a deal with the international community. They promised that they would fulfill this one and that one, and then they continue to violate those things. So which party could ensure that after the economic assistance or the humanitarian assistance to the Afghan Taliban is given, they would continue not to violate more promises that they would commit to the international community?
Well, I think as a result of U.S. policy in the last 20, 30 years, there's distrust for the United States to play such a role. And I think that's a legitimate attitude. The United States is not a neutral player in this. But the countries that could play a role, the most important, as I think all of you will agree, is Pakistan. But Pakistan is limited by energy needs, by economic policy, and that's why it's so important for this to be multinational, including China and including Russia. If you had the Shanghai Cooperation Organization nations, for example, working together, you could build trust in the Taliban that maybe they would be able to see a way out of military confrontation. If it depends on the United States, as an American, I have to say, I wouldn't trust the United States, whether it's Democratic Party or Republican Party, because our policies have been for the benefit of a small group of corporate cartels and not for international peace.
Right. Mr. Khan, when we talk about the other aspect which happens to be at the forefront when it comes to bilateral cooperation between Pakistan and Russia, it's energy cooperation. An 80-member delegation was here in this very month, headed by the energy minister of Russia also. So we do have the Pakistan Stream gas pipeline in the pipeline also. So what dividends do you think both the countries have when it comes to energy cooperation? Of course, Pakistan's import bills happens to be one of the largest when it comes to expenditures, and there is a huge demand for gas and oil in Pakistan as well. So do you think there is a huge dividend that this particular burden from Pakistan would be reduced considerably?
To the extent that Pakistan ought to diversify the sources of energy, and the fact that at some point in the future connectivity will improve. Right now the problem is of logistics. They don't have a port which is near us, so it takes much longer to get oil here, the greater distance. It costs a lot more in terms of freight, and nowadays the serious issues are those of provision of a supply chain. India, for example, owns 5 or 6 large tankers and can transport. We will have a tough time finding a company which will be willing to bring that oil to Pakistan. We will have a tough time finding an insurer for the product. So in the immediate future, I don't see this being very, very practical. The other thing is Pakistan has 5 refineries. Out of these 5 refineries, 3 are almost totally committed to Middle East producers, and they have long-term agreements. We cannot renege on those agreements. 2 of these refineries have said they are capable of refining Russian oil. So there is that lack of capacity in refining also. But there's no doubt in my mind that we need to think in the long term, and energy is always going to be important globally, and we ought to have a second source. So no matter what it does, we need to carry on with these negotiations, and we need to learn more and more about the obstacles and the pitfalls during these discussions.
Of course, there are going to be comprehensive discussions regarding the areas that you have mentioned when it comes to acquiring that oil from Russia. You have mentioned distance and the freight cost, and also having a viable company regarding that, and the issue of insurance. Mr. Musaddiq Malik has categorically said that we are looking comprehensively into these issues. How important it is going to be for Pakistan in meeting its energy demand with having a second source from Russia, Dr. Malik?
I think the ambassador is very right here. You need to diversify your access for raw materials and resources such as petroleum products. We're even making deals with UAE to enhance our relationship with them further. And logistically, you're correct, absolutely correct. Without the play of Central Asian countries and Afghanistan come to some sense of peace, nobody's really going to look at that avenue, which is very important, and it's been on the cards for decades, in fact. I remember when I was researching on Afghanistan in the mid-90s, and this was an important facet of the idea of the emergence of Taliban, to create a point where they could have a country that was at peace with itself and with its neighbors, and could allow the opening up of Central Asian countries and Russia as well. That may be a possibility, and that needs to be enacted upon with the Taliban. And this is where Russia may be able to play a part in this as a more neutral party as opposed to Pakistan. We have our influences, but then we have our problems as well. As you know about the attack in Peshawar today, I mean, a devastating attack, and we should give our prayers to the people that have been injured and that have died. But this is just a symptom of what the circumstances are between us and Afghanistan, and the fact that the terrorists are holed up in Afghanistan and the Taliban need to deal with them. The Taliban need to deal with them concretely. Let's look back 20 years on what happened after 9/11 and Taliban had Osama bin Laden, but wouldn't give him up because of hospitality, memandari, etc., as part of the principles of Pashtunwali. This may be the same thing as far as TTP is concerned, because they feel that they're seeking asylum in Afghanistan, that the Pashtun culture has to abide by that. But the fact is, this is actually very detrimental to the future of Afghanistan and stability within the region, and every single country and neighbor in the region and extra-regional countries are concerned about this, where it includes China, Russia, Central Asia, the Saudis, the Arab states, Iran, Pakistan, and other countries further afield are very concerned about what is happening in Afghanistan right now, as far as the emboldenment of these non-state actor groups and the way they are utilizing Afghan territory against Pakistan and may do so against other countries. And that's what the fear is, that it may turn back 20 years again and the same type of governance structure may erupt, because there are so many hardliners in the government there, and that's why we need to influence the right people, to empower the right people in the Afghan government as well, by all sides working together as a region and putting pressure on Afghanistan to say, look, you can be part of the community and you could be accepted, but you have to behave in a certain manner. And that's globally accepted as well.
Right. Mr. Schlanger, when it comes to Pakistan's energy cooperation with Russia, of course, there's a huge energy demand in Pakistan. Also, Pakistan is looking forward to have new avenues to get its energy demand met. And when we talk about Russia also, it also looks forward to have new market avenues in the world. Now, what sort of a potential do you think is associated with when it comes to the energy cooperation between Russia and Pakistan in particular?
Well, I think one of the other guests pointed out there are logistical problems. On the other hand, there are logistical problems for Russia providing oil and gas to China, which they're addressing now. And the development of pipelines and other forms of connectivity actually are good for the economy for both countries as well as the countries between them. So I think for the longer term, Russia is going to continue to be one of the leading suppliers of oil and gas in the world. Pakistan, if it continues to develop economically, is going to need increased sources of energy. And let's not forget also that Russia and China are at the forefront of developing nuclear power and nuclear power plants. So there's a whole realm of opportunity and potential in energy cooperation. And the Russians need it, and Pakistan needs it. So it's one of these win-win situations. And it also creates the kind of economic stability that will benefit countries such as Afghanistan. And let me just make one final point on Afghanistan. To me, the most important gesture to the Taliban would be if the United States would say, we're going to give you back the money we stole from you. I don't know what the response would be in Afghanistan. I assume it might be relief, but it might also be a move toward encouraging the kind of forgiveness that would allow nations to cooperate in the future. And so that would be my recommendation to the United States.
Through what channels do you think that if the United States decides the way you have just suggested, so what sort of channels do you think would be the most viable in order to channel in that amount of money so that it is reaching to the very grassroots level and to avert that humanitarian crisis the Afghan people are faced with actually?
Well, you'd need certain guarantees, which would include from the Taliban, which is the one government that's functioning in Afghanistan, but you'd also need to have something the United States has not been so willing to do, which is to provide guidance and direction. It's all been one way. The money was pulled out, the U.S. pulled out, and then is continuing to, in a sense, with the sanctions, threaten Afghanistan. So if you were to say, we're going to provide this money, we'll set up some kind of channel, maybe through the United Nations, maybe through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or the Organization of Islamic Cooperation would be another one that would be possible, to oversee that the money is fairly and equitably distributed. That would go a long way towards resolving and atoning, in a sense, for the damage that was done since 9/11 by the United States in that part of the world.
Right. Mr. Khan, one other aspect when it comes to bilateral relationship between Pakistan and Russia, the people-to-people contacts, enhancing the contact in the cultural area as well as in the field of education. How important is that, and what sort of a potential do you think lie in those domains?
Well, in any relationship between two countries, people-to-people contacts are extremely important. That is how you create stakes on both sides. So it's not just cultural, but more importantly, you have financial stakes that you create in each country, so that whenever relationships are not that good, if there's a certain amount of abrasiveness, these vested interests then go out and lobby and strengthen, shore up the relationship. So yes, it's extremely important. And we have had such cooperation in the past. And so, there is no reason why we should not make concrete efforts to strengthen this. It's a very good idea.
Right, Dr. Aqab, Malik, how to enhance relations between Pakistan and Russia when it comes to educational, cultural domains?
I think it's important. I'm a professor, so education is my field, and it's been my life. And I think that cooperation between different countries, enhancing each other's institutions and ability to organize and be better at the educational facilities, for example, through interaction between professors and students and exchange programs. The problem here is that we're always sending people out and asking for others to help us. And we should have some type of exchange coming the other way as well. And to this extent, just a couple of months ago, we had a whole program organized by the HEC, but I ran and managed coordinated the whole program with 30 Afghan professors at NUST, who we educated to an extent and trained for capacity building so that they can go back to Afghanistan and help run their institutions better. And it was a 3-week program, and we have more coming when the situation settles down a bit more. So we have numerous other situations like this that we can organize, not just from Russia and Afghanistan, but African countries in interaction with the rest of the world. I think we can make a focal point here in Pakistan to allow this to occur, because education is a burgeoning institution and activity in Pakistan now. So, and it's becoming better.
Dr. Malik, when it comes to cultural assimilation between two different cultures, as one Russia is and the other Pakistan, so what sort of barriers do you think are needed to be overcome in that regard? Is language one of the main barriers in that regard when it comes to enhancing people-to-people contacts?
I think communication doesn't have any barriers really between two people who don't even know the language that they can communicate in. Usually we know a third language. I go to China, I speak in English. I don't speak in Urdu. I don't speak in Chinese because my Mandarin isn't very good. It's very depleted, I think. But I'm able to get my message across with them in any form of language. I think communication isn't the issue. It is the willingness to go ahead and enhance each other, and that's what matters here. I think interaction between institutions like NUST, which is a premier institution in Pakistan, and Moscow State, for example, would be an advantage for this country to get intellectuals on both sides communicating together, as it is with Tsinghua in China, for example, and King's College in London and Johns Hopkins in America, for example.
Right. Mr. Khan, your take regarding this particular thing. Are there any barriers that are needed to be overcome?
In fact, if there are any barriers, first of all, because of the internet, I think a lot more Russians now speak and understand English, and so do we. So, that aspect of it may not be a major obstacle. But having said that, in the very near future, with artificial intelligence and automation and all this, you will see that the whole paradigm of education needs to be changed. Because today the students are spending far too much time in learning things which are available at the click of a button. And now you have things like Chat GPT and things like that, which will have its own problems nevertheless. But I'm absolutely sure that this will enable the world to get closer together. And we now have to create or let's say strengthen things like creativity. When you have all these tools, when I have Chat GPT which can actually write software for me, I have to be creative enough to make use of that. So those are the strengths. Or create a field where people learn to be more articulate. If there are certain technologies which are disrupting, let's say, a physician, where the technology can better diagnose diseases or recommend tests or something, a physician will still have to learn good bedside manners to have these sort of skills that we need to develop. So the whole paradigm of education will have a sea change in the near future.
Mr. Schlanger, what's your take regarding when it comes to enhancing the contact between Pakistan and Russia as far as education is concerned? And you've heard Mr. Khan giving a very different point of view regarding this. The whole paradigm of the education would change, and the language doesn't happen to be a major barrier when it comes to enhancing the people-to-people contacts between Russians and Pakistanis.
Made, which is most important, is it's the intention. If you have an intention to cooperate and collaborate, if you have a desire to have relations between sovereign nations, then you can overcome the communications problems. And English might be a way of doing that, but that's not the only way. The important thing is that we have to demonstrate, each nation, that while we intend to maintain our own sovereignty, we recognize the sovereign interests of other nations and wish to collaborate with them. And this is one of the things that led to the end of confrontation in Europe in the middle of the 16th century. The whole fight for a recognition that people may have different religions, different languages, but we're one human race. And if you try to divide it up and divide up the interests, then language isn't the problem. The problem is the intention to divide and conquer. We have to overcome these kinds of geopolitical ideas, and then the intention to cooperate will allow the mechanisms for us to do that.
Right, Mr. Harley Schlanger, political analyst, joining us on Skype from Germany. Thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. And Professor Dr. Aqab Malik, associated with Center for International Peace and Stability at NUST. Thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on Views on News tonight. And Mr. Nasir Ali Khan, former ambassador, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. And from the entire discussion, we can conclude that the bilateral relationship between Pakistan and Russia is, of course, on a positive trajectory. A lot of things have been talked about when it comes to cooperation in the energy sector, trade, investment, and economy, as well as there are certain ideas which have been suggested by our panelists in order to enhance the links into the education and cultural field. Of course, there is a huge potential when it comes to collaborating together between Pakistan and Russia to ensure peace and stability in the region vis-a-vis Afghanistan as well. With that, we come to the end of today's Views on News. Till the next one, take good care of yourselves.